What a great day this is. What a tremendous day the Lord blessed us with. We were able to see some family members today at church visiting with you and thus visiting with us. And it was good to see them. Didn't get to see everybody, but I got to see most everybody. And so that's a good thing. And we were very pleased to meet those that we were able to meet this morning. Hope that you had a good day. What a great day. Sunshine, was able to get out a few minutes, able to rest for a few minutes, able to think about next week's sermons and what it's going to do this week. And so what a great day. Hope you've had a great day as well. If you have your Bibles with you, you might want to turn to the book of 1 Peter. We're studying out of that right now. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11 through verse 20 is where we are this evening. It is a great, great study, and I hope hopefully that the things that are said tonight, you'll be able to gain a great deal from them. There was a group of individuals that had gone on one of these tour vacations, and the bus brought the group to a monastery, and they were grouped then, and just a few, like about 10, I think, could go at a time in a group, and they carried them to places on this monastery. It was a beautiful place. The grounds were immaculate. The flowers were well kept. The lifestyle was slow. The language was simple. Everything was just sort of like you would just be at rest, almost, be at peace. And finally, one of the visitors, one of the folks on the guided tour, looked over at another as they were standing looking at a beautiful scenery out from where they were. And one looked and said to the other, said, I could really be a Christian here if I had to be. That's true. If we slow down, we think about, oh man, I could be a Christian here, right? If I could just retire and kick back, I could be a Christian. And yet Peter says we're a Christian all the time. Peter begins this great book of 1 Peter by talking about hope. And then he takes off on a different direction, really, in the last part of the first chapter, and going into the second chapter, he talks about living. And so it really is, you could say, he says, okay, there's a hope, and now he says, live for that hope. Live so that you can gain that hope. And especially in verses 12 or 11 through 20 that we want to look at tonight, Peter says, look, as Christians, you got to live in the world, but you don't live like the world. You live different from the world. You live as lights that shine out in a very corrupt and very dark society and very dark time. And so he encourages us to live like a Christian lives. Well, how's a Christian live? We might ask that, well, how does a Christian live? And Peter gives us that answer. We want to begin in chapter 2 of 1 Peter. We want to begin in verse 12, and he gives us several different things for us to think about, and we'll go quickly tonight, but we'll try to cover the topic at hand. Notice what he says. He says, first of all, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. He says, having your conduct, or the way you live, honorable. The word honorable is the idea of honest or excellent. It's beautiful on the outside is the way the word means. It's the idea of lovely or gracious. I kind of like the summary that I read in studying for this. Somebody said it's letting your life be a beautiful picture. That's what living honorably is. And notice what he says, live honorably among the Gentiles. The word Gentiles here has the idea of everybody in the world. Live honorably, live like a beautiful picture before the world. We are strangers and pilgrims, as we found out last week in 1 Peter chapter 2. And we are living as strangers and pilgrims. Matter of fact, he even says in verse 11, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lust. The majority of our world is unsaved. Matter of fact, someone sent me an article this week that only 47% of people in the world today say that they're Christians. And that's used in a broad sense from the standpoint of they believe in Christianity. Only 47% of the world believes that. Someone asked me this week, I was talking with them over the phone, and they asked me about if I had noticed on, say, Facebook taking surveys. And I said, no, I don't usually take surveys. But they said that they had noticed in a lot of the questions that if they ask you, your religious preference, Christianity is either towards the bottom or not at all in the surveys. Well, maybe this is the answer, 47%. What does that mean? What does that mean for us? Well, it means that we're in the minority. But being in the minority still does not mean that we are less. And it does not mean that we are to conform to them. Matter of fact, what does Paul say? Don't be conformed, but be transformed in Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. We're to live as Christians really above and beyond reproach. Put on the Lord Jesus Christ, Paul wrote in Romans 13 and verse 14, and make no provisions for the flesh to fulfill its lust. That we're to be blameless and harmless, the children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 15. That's how we're to live our life. We're to live our life godly. We're to live our life as a beautiful picture, a picture of Christ. Isn't that what it's supposed to be? In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18, Paul talked about we all with open face beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord are changed into his image. You see, the picture that we live and the picture that we're trying to paint before others and the picture we want folks to see is Jesus Christ. And so when Peter says, before the world, I want you to live like a beautiful picture, I want you to live like the picture of Christ. Dear friends, in living in this world, do folks see Christ in you and through you? You might say, well, preacher, I hadn't really thought about it. Well, have you ever thought about the Sermon on the Mount? I'm sure you have. Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. You see, they see the Lord in you. And so it is that we have to remember that we as individuals are to live a beautiful picture before others. But then Peter says in verse 13 and 14, and again in verse 17, let's just think about what verse 13 says. He says, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to kings as supreme, or verse 14, to governors as to those who are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. Peter says, live in submission to the government. The word submit there, notice what he says in verse 13, submit yourselves. The word submit is a military expression. It's the idea of to arrange in formation, to arrange under the commander, to be in subjection to. In the service, and I never have served in the service, but if you have served in the service, you know that there is a rank, and each one under that rank respects that rank. As Christians, we respect government. Government is ordained by God. In Romans chapter 13, verse 1, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. We often don't think of government in that way. But that's what Paul said. Paul said, by inspiration in Romans 13, that governing authorities have been, if you will, put in place, and we are, as individuals, to submit and to subject ourselves to that government. Understanding, if you're still there in Romans 13, look in verse 4. For he, in the context there, is talking about the government, is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister as an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Think about what Paul says there. Paul, in talking about the government, does not endorse, nor does he say that God endorses a specific style of government. I am thankful, very thankful, that I live in the United States of America. I am very, very thankful that I live in a democracy, that I live with a tremendous amount of freedom. And I'm thankful that God has ordained that government. But do you know that in Romans 13 or in 1 Peter chapter 2, God doesn't say you're subject to a democracy. Notice what he calls government, governing powers, to the ordinances or the laws that Peter says, the laws of men. You see, God doesn't ordain a particular or specific style or form or type of government. And so one could live in a monarchy or in a democracy such as we live. One could live in totalitarianism or socialism or any type of government. And God says, or rather God tells us by inspiration, that we, as members of whatever government we are under, we are to listen to and we are to be in subjection to that government. Now, we realize and understand the limits of the government, don't we? We realize and understand that government cannot violate the laws of God and us follow that government. But as long as the government is not violating the laws of God, they may set laws, they may set rules that we don't like. You know, there's sometimes in some areas where the speed limit is a certain limit, and I'm thinking, I don't like that. I think we can go faster. I think the road's better and we can go faster. That doesn't matter. That's what, for reasons maybe that I don't know, that speed limit has been set in that particular area. Or in driving down the road, you say, well, there's a stop sign. Well, that's crazy for a stop sign to be there. There's not a need for a stop sign, but government has put it there. Government makes laws. Now, I don't always agree with the laws that are made in our country, and I'm sure you don't either. But yet I have to respect the government. Why? Because that's what God tells me to do. God tells me to obey the government. Titus chapter 3, verse 1, remind them to be subject to rulers and to authorities, to obey and to be ready for every good work. And I am to pray for my government and my governing officials, whomever they may be, even if I don't agree with them. In 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 1, Paul wrote to Timothy and he says, I exhort, therefore, first of all, that supplications and prayers and intercession and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and all in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in godliness and reverence. Now, I want them to do what I want them to do the way I want them to do it, and they may not always do it. But God says that my role is to obey government, to pray for governing authorities. And then in Romans chapter 13, verse 6 and 7, I'm to render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. I'm to pay my taxes. Now, when I think of that, and I think of what Jesus said, to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and I think of what Paul said, and yet Rome was corrupt. Rome was terrible. And yet God said, you pay your taxes, you pay your tributes, you give your taxes to them just like you've been told. And that is what God expects of us. God expects us to be individuals that follow the government. Now, what's the purpose of the government? Well, Peter gives us an answer for that. He says, really, the government is created to create fear that restrains the evildoer and punishes those who have done wrong and protect those who have done right. That's the purpose of government. And so Peter says, you want to live the Christian life like you're supposed to? Submit to the government. But now let's go on. Verse 15 gives us another point in Christian life. Look what Peter wrote. He says, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of the foolish man. He says, I want you to live a good life. Why? Because you're watched. And so I want you to be a good example. People are watching you. People are seeing what you're doing. People are, as we said last week, you're the only Bible that some folks read. We need to live what we have been preaching. We need to practice what we preach. There was a missionary one time that went into a country in Nigeria. And when he went in to settle in, to do his mission work, he was summoned to a king to come and to talk to the king. Well, he wanted to talk to the king about following the gospel, about obeying the truth. And the king told the missionary, he said, I'm going to watch you for 2 years. And he said, at the end of 2 years, depending upon what I see, depends upon whether I listen to you or not. At the end of 2 years, the king called for the missionary. He listened to what the missionary had to say, and he was baptized for the remission of his sins. It's all about living the life, isn't it? It's all about letting your light shine. It's all about conducting your life honorably, as we said, as a beautiful picture. It's all about being a good example. As Christians, we're charged to be careful and to live careful lives, to be sure that our words and our actions cause others to look on the Lord and to look on him favorably. Yes, to walk the talk. Paul would write to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12, and he would say, let no one despise your youth, but be an example of the believers in word and conduct, in love and spirit, in faith and purity. Paul says, look, folks are going to be looking at you. You lead a good life. You lead the life that is in accordance to the will of God. In all things, Paul would write to Titus, showing yourself a pattern of good works. You know, a good name is important, isn't it? A good name is rather to be had than precious ointment. Solomon reminds us in the book of Ecclesiastes. But a good name is had by how? By living the way you talk. You see, here's the important aspect. We can't come to church on Sunday and then live like we want to the rest of the week. We can't talk about loving God on Sunday and then not love him the rest of the week. There was a young boy that put in an application to work at a particular place. And when he did, he was asked to list his references, and he listed his preacher, he listed his Bible school teacher, and he listed an elder in church. And the man with the job called this young boy in, and he said, "Son," he said, "I'm thinking about hiring you." And he said, I need some references. And the young boy said, "Well, yes, sir." Said, "I put them on the sheet there, the application that you asked me to fill out." The employer looked at him. He said, "Son," he said, "I want somebody that knows you the other 6 days of the week to talk. I want to talk to them." Well, it's easy to be good in church, isn't it? But we have to live in such a way as to be a good example before others. Notice what Peter says. He says, "You do that to put to silence the ignorance of foolish men." He says, you do that, you live the good life Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, so that what is considered the foolish or the senseless may be made speechless, and thus they may be ones that speak against Christianity, but now all of a sudden they can't. They're speechless because you're living the life that you were supposed to live. And so we ask, are you putting your best foot forward? Are folks wanting to talk to you about Christianity because of the life that you live? Peter says, look, if you're going to live out in the world, you've got to be a good example. But then notice what he says in verse 17. He says, as Christians living in the world, you've got to honor all people, honor all men. Every man has worth, and every individual has value. We're all created, every one of us that inhabit the face of this earth are created in God's image, according to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26. It is for all of us, for all of the world. What does that mean? Rich, poor, male, female, black, white, American, those that are not American. God was not discriminatory. God does not see, if you will, color. God does not see nationality. There's neither male nor female. There's neither bond nor free, for we're all one in Christ Jesus. Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. Christ died for all, according to 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 6, who gave himself a ransom for all, Paul tells us. Yep. All men are valuable. All men are important. And so we're not to be discriminatory towards anyone. James 2, James tells us there how that putting someone before others and putting someone on a pedestal, especially within regards to the worship service, being prejudicial towards folks is wrong. We don't discriminate. It means that it does not mean that we ignore levels of authority or that we tolerate everyone's conduct. But it does mean that we show proper respect towards every individual because we're all made in the image of God. You're not better than I am. I'm not better than you are. My dad raised me with an expression that I kind of thought weird when I was young, but the older I get, the more I see the wisdom in it. He said that we all put our pants on the same way, one leg at a time. And there's truth in that. He was trying to show me that those with more money than we had, they were not better than us. Those that didn't go to church like we did were not terrible people from the standpoint of we should disrespect them. we may not agree with them religiously, and we may want for their good to obey the gospel and to come to church with us and follow the Lord. But we still must value them as people. And so Peter says, you want to live in the world? Fine. You've got to remember to honor all people. But then, jump down to verse 18. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. Peter says, be a good employee. Now, I realize a large contingency of our number is retired. And I am thankful for your work and for the fact that you have reached that wonderful milestone in your life. But if we're to let our light so shine before men, Peter says we got to be good workers. You know, God made us as workers, didn't he? In Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, when God put man in the garden, what was the purpose of man being in the garden? He was to till it. He was to observe it. He was to keep it. In other words, he was to work it. He wasn't just to look at it and say, boy, isn't this beautiful? That's not the way it works. He says he's to be a worker. And after all, isn't that what Paul would write? In Ephesians chapter 2, he would say, for we are his workmanship, created to God through Christ Jesus unto good works. Now, I think he was talking religiously there, but yet at the same point in time, too, he's saying we're workers. The Bible would tell us how that we're to be good laborers. Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to give to him who has need. That he might give, as Ephesians 6, verse 5 and 6, that he may give an honest day's work for an honest day's wages. Back years ago, I worked with a congregation, and the treasurer was one of the elders. And he would give me my check every Sunday. He would give me my check, and I would get paid. And he'd walk up to me before Bible school. He'd find me usually when I was talking to people, but he'd find me where he could just face me one-on-one. And with a smile, he'd hand me my check, and he would say, did you earn this week? Did you earn this week? And while it was a joke between the two of us, it made me realize, and it made me understand, and it made me think that I need to work this week so that when he gives me my check, I can say, yes, sir, I earned it. And a lot of times, because like I say, he was an elder, I'd say, yes, sir, I earned it. And I might, if we were by ourselves, I might give him a earful about what all I did. And he was always a good guy. He would always smile. He said, oh, I know you earned it. But he would just remind me, earn your money. Good employees don't only just give a good day's work for a good day's wage, but they don't stir up trouble in the workplace. Notice that Peter says, basically, that you're going to have good bosses and you're going to have bad bosses. You're going to have some that are good and gentle, and you're going to have some that are harsh. And Peter didn't say, just be the good employee to the good employer. Peter says, you be a good employee even to the harsh. And so as Christians, no matter what we do for a living, Peter says, you want to live in the world and do what's right? Be a good employee. Man one time applied for a job as a farmhand. He was going to be, matter of fact, the head farmhand on this farm. There wasn't very many hands in it, but nevertheless, as he was talking to the man that had the farm, the farmer asked him, said, well, what makes you think you're qualified for this job? And the man said, well, I can sleep at night. And the farmer thought that just an odd statement. I can sleep at night. But, he went on and he hired the man. And he thought about that for 2-3 days. I can sleep at night. And then finally, one evening after supper, a storm started boiling up and coming in. And the old farmer went out and checked. All the livestock was put up. The barn was closed as tight as it could be. All the windows were made secure. Everything was in place. And then he thought, he'd taken care of everything just like he was supposed to. He's able to sleep tonight. That's what he meant. I'm able to sleep at night. Be a good employee, no matter the boss. But then Peter also says in verse 19, for this is commendable, if because of conscience towards God, one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. Peter says, you want to live in the world? He says, endure trials, endure persecution. We know, because we've read of history, we've read of the difficulty with regards to persecution. We've read of the difficulty with regards to Christians living their life, and how that they were beaten, and how that Christians were crucified, and how Christians were thrown in pits of oil and lit to make light, or if you will, human torches for gardens such as Caligula did in his day and age. And we read of that persecution and we think, boy, Peter really had to remind them, because they really had to be sure that they didn't give in to that persecution. Well, folks, we face persecution today as well. We have problems. We need to stand the course and stand up for what's right. We're constantly made fun of as folks that if we have faith in God, we're folks that don't know much. And not only don't know much, but we're not the sophisticated, cultured people of the world. We're often made fun of and provoked. But Paul reminds us in Philippians chapter 1, verse 29, for you it has been granted in behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. Yeah, I'm going to suffer as Christian, and I'm going to suffer persecution, and I'm going to suffer difficult times. But James reminds me in James chapter 5 and verse 10 that the prophets were examples in suffering and patience, and I must be. That I must be faithful even to the point of death, Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. That I must endure the hardships and the heartaches. That folks may make fun of what I believe and how I conduct my life, but I'm still to live in accordance to the will of God. Now, here's what Peter says. Peter says, as a Christian living in the world, conduct your life honorably, submit to the government, be a good example, honor all men, be a good employee, endure trials and persecution. And we have to ask ourselves, how in the world are we going to do this? Well, if you look back in verse 17, he says, fear God. In other words, a respect for God says, okay, God, what do you want me to do? How do you want me to live my life? What do you want me to show others? And invariably he says, I want you to show me to others. Well, how do you do that? By respecting me and respecting my word. How do you live 24/7? How do you live the Christian life 24/7? Fear God. When you fear God, all these things, conducting your life honorably, submitting to the government, being a good example, living honorably and amongst people, being a good employee, being faithful, honoring all men. How does all that fall into place? Because you respect God and his will, and you're willing to say, how do I do these things? And you keep them in mind and you live them. Now, Peter's going to answer, can we do that? We're going to study that next week as we look at the example of Jesus Christ and how to live that life. Peter's going to show us that Jesus is a great example for us. And so we look forward to our study together next week as we continue in 1 Peter chapter 2 and look at the example of Jesus. Hope that you'll be with us then. Hope that you'll be with us Wednesday night. We're going to be studying. We'll pick back up with our study in the book of Hebrews. We'll start there in verse 5 of Hebrews chapter 1. We'll review, but that's where we'll pick up, and we hope that you'll be there with us for that study, and we hope that you'll be with us again next Sunday morning. We continue our fruit of the Spirit. We'll be talking about gentleness goodness, not to gentleness, but goodness, and we look forward to that study then, and we look forward to you being with us. Hope as you get your shots, and as George said Wednesday night, you get out a free jail card when you've reached that 2 weeks after your shots, that you'll come back to worship with us. We look forward to more and more people coming back as you get your shots and get your time built up. We thank you for listening. We hope you have a great week, and may God bless you and keep you is our fervent prayer.